I have known the Duke of Halvenmere for 31 years. I was there when he took his first commission at 17, a spare and serious boy with his father's name on his papers and a look in his eye that made older officers choose their words before they spoke to him. I was there when he buried his father and signed his name on the title deeds with a hand that did not tremble, though his jaw was iron and his eyes were too still. He had learned that grief was a private country, and he would enter it only when no one was watching. I was there in the Low Countries, in the winter mud of a campaign that had no name until afterward, when he carried a man twice his size off a ridge that should have killed them both. And I was there when he did not speak of it afterward. Not once, not ever, not to me, not to anyone. I have seen him negotiate treaty terms with men who frightened ministers. I have seen him stand in the House of Lords and say nothing for a long minute while every other peer in that chamber waited, every man of them filling that silence with his own anxiety, and then say 3 quiet sentences that ended the argument entirely. I have seen him be ruthless in a way that never crossed into cruelty, and I have seen him be generous in ways he never permitted to be witnessed. Estates quietly preserved when they should have been seized, debts absolved without acknowledgement, a living arranged for a widow whose husband had served under him in the campaign. I have watched him manage 600 years of a great estate with the same systematic precision he had applied to military problems. He understood that order was not an end but a precondition, that the work of keeping a great thing alive required constant, unglamorous attention, and he gave it. And I have watched him sit at dinner in his own house with 300 candles burning and say nothing to anyone for an entire evening because there was nothing he wanted to say. That is perhaps the truest portrait of him, a man of considerable power and genuine depth who found, more often than not, that the world did not offer him anything worth saying. I thought I knew every shape of him. I did not know this one. I did not know the shape of Marcus Aldrich Vane, the Duke of Halvenmere, standing in the yard of a second-rate solicitor's office in a village called Merton Croft, in the county of Aldwick, in a light drizzle on an unremarkable Tuesday in April, watching a young woman keep her chin level while a red-faced creditor read the terms of her father's ruin aloud, and feeling, though I did not know it yet, and he certainly did not, the particular, irrevocable quality of a thing that is about to change everything. I will tell it as I saw it, and as he told it to me later in pieces, over the course of a year that neither of us had expected to live inside of. My name is Colonel Everard Lorne. I am godfather to his eldest niece, closest friend to the man himself for more than 3 decades, and the only person he has ever asked to tell this story properly. He said when he asked me, "You saw the beginning of it, you'll say it true." I told him I would try. He said, "That's all I'm asking." I have kept my word, Your Grace, I always do. We were passing through Merton Croft on our way north to Halvenmere itself, the great estate in Yorkshire that gives Marcus his title, his seat, his considerable burden of history. We had been in London for 6 weeks on parliamentary business that had ground Marcus down in the way that particular machine always managed to do, not through any single outrage, but through the accumulated weight of men saying things they did not believe to achieve ends they could not name. On our last morning in the city, he had said to me, at breakfast, with a patience that was clearly nearly exhausted, "I want to be on the road by 6. I want to be home by Tuesday." Home for Marcus meant the wide Yorkshire moors and the stone towers of Halvenmere, where he could breathe without it costing him anything, where the problems were concrete and solvable, and did not require him to be diplomatic about their nature. We had the carriage and 2 outriders, and we had been making good time until the main road through Aldwick flooded. A late spring rain had turned the lower road to soup, not dramatically, not with any violence, just the steady saturation of weeks of wet weather finding its level. And we were diverted through Merton Croft by a local man who pointed us down the lane with the cheerful authority of someone who knows the roads for 30 miles in every direction. A very small village. A single inn of moderate quality, a Norman church that had seen better centuries and knew it, a solicitor's office that shared a building with a draper's shop, and made that arrangement look natural, and a baker's that smelled of burnt sugar and rye, and had a boy sweeping its step with great thoroughness and no particular speed. The kind of village that has been exactly itself for a very long time. The delay was an hour at most, they told us. The coachman needed to check a loose wheel fitting that had been worrying him since Grantham, and there was a farrier in the village who could help him determine whether it needed addressing now or could wait for Halvenmere. Marcus got out to stretch his legs. I got out because he did, and because the inn looked as if it might have a decent fire and something warm to drink. That was when I heard it. Not shouting. The opposite of shouting, which was what made it audible above the light rain and the noise of the farrier's yard down the lane and the general unremarkable sound of a village going about its Tuesday morning. A woman's voice, very low, very controlled, with the particular quality of a voice that has been kept low and controlled for some time, and is managing it without effort. That is not what the document says, Mr. Fells. I would ask you to read it again. I looked across the yard in the open doorway of the solicitor's office, which had a step up and a narrow porch and a painted board that read B. Fells, solicitor, notary, licensed conveyancer, in letters that had been touched up recently with paint that had not quite matched the old. There were 4 people. One was a round-faced man in a brown coat who was visibly sweating despite the drizzle. The solicitor himself, Mr. B. Fells, with the look of a man who has found himself at the center of something that began as a routine professional matter and has developed over the course of the morning into something considerably more wearing. One was a heavy gentleman of about 55 with reddish skin, and the build of a man who had eaten well for a long time, and spent very little of his considerable energy on anything that was not eating or being agreed with. He had the air, I recognized it the moment I looked at him, of a man who operated entirely through established precedent, who believed that social arrangements, once made, were simply carried out, and that a woman explaining the wording of a legal instrument to him in a solicitor's doorway was an unexpected development of the most unwelcome kind. One was a younger man, sharp-faced and watchful, standing slightly behind the heavy one with a pencil held ready above a small notebook, clearly the secretary or agent, whose role this morning appeared to consist of being prepared to record whatever victory his employer achieved. And one was a young woman in a gray wool dress with a mud-stained hem, standing on the porch step with her hands clasped loosely in front of her and her back as straight as a rifle. She was perhaps 22 or 23. Brown hair pulled up under a plain bonnet that had been good once and was now simply serviceable. A face that was, in that moment, entirely composed, not blank, which would have been easier and less interesting, but composed in the way a person is composed who has made a deliberate decision about what they will and will not let happen to their expression, and who has been holding to that decision, by the look of her, for considerably longer than this morning alone. She was reading aloud from a document she held in both hands, reading at a measured pace that made clear she had read it before and knew exactly which parts mattered. The heavy gentleman was talking over her. "My dear young woman," he was saying in the voice of a man extending considerable patience and wanting it noted, "the terms have been agreed. Your father agreed them. The solicitor witnessed them. The question of the wording is no longer at issue because the matter has been settled, and what is required now is simply the execution of." "The question of the wording," she said, not raising her voice, not interrupting so much as simply continuing as though he had not spoken, which was a choice that required more precision than volume, "is entirely the question at hand, Baron Strachey, because the clause you are citing reads, in settlement of the full sum. It does not read in settlement of any sum, and it does not read in settlement of the primary sum. And the distinction is significant because my father signed in settlement of the full sum, which has not yet been assessed, because Mr. Fells's accounting of the secondary debts has not been completed." She paused, just briefly, in a way that managed to be fair without being generous. "I am not suggesting bad faith, Baron Strachey. I am suggesting that we wait for the accounting because the instrument requires it." Baron Strachey's color deepened. His secretary's pencil stilled above the notebook. Mr. Fells said, in a voice that had given up all pretense of professional neutrality and was now simply one of pure misery, "The thing is, Miss Ashworth, the Baron has driven down from Dunwich, which is a considerable journey, and his schedule does not easily—" "The Baron's schedule," she said, with a calm that was really rather extraordinary to hear from a doorstep, "is a matter of his preference. The terms of the instrument are a matter of law. I know which one governs our situation." Marcus had stopped walking. I noticed it the way I notice most things Marcus does, by the fact that he had been moving and then was not, and by the change in quality of his attention, which is different from most people's in that it is not demonstrative. He was perhaps 20 feet away, standing near the pillar of the inn's yard gate with his arms folded and his coat collar turned up against the drizzle. He was not looking at the carriage or the sky or the church or anything else in Merton Croft. He was looking at the doorway of B. Fells, solicitor, with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he had decided were interesting. Problems, anomalies, situations that had more in them than they appeared to at first look. I came to stand beside him. "What is that?" he said, quietly enough that only I could hear. "A dispute," I said. "Debt settlement from the sound of it." "Her father's." "That would be my guess." He was quiet for a moment. In the doorway, Miss Ashworth had produced a second document from somewhere, a folded sheet she had clearly brought with her, prepared before she came, which she now unfolded with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been preparing documents for a long time and has learned to anticipate what the next stage will require. And she handed it to the solicitor with the air of a woman who had spent considerable time ensuring that this exact moment would go exactly as she had planned. "This is the preliminary accounting I commissioned from Mr. Pell of Aldwick 3 weeks ago," she said. "You'll see the secondary debts listed on page 2. The total that my father signed in settlement of has not yet been fixed. It cannot be less than the primary sum, but it may be considerably more, which affects the interpretation of the full sum clause, and therefore the question of whether the instrument can be properly executed before the accounting is complete. I would ask you to look at Section 4 specifically." Baron Strachey had moved, by this point, from patience into something that was still within the range of civil, but was covering its edges. "This is not how these matters are handled," he said. She did not step back. She did not step down from the step. She looked at him with the expression of a person who has considered losing and decided against it, and said, "Then perhaps you could tell me how they are handled, Baron Strachey, because I have been managing them for 11 months, and I should very much like to know if I have been doing it incorrectly." I heard Marcus make a sound. It was not quite a laugh. He was not a man who laughed easily in public. But it was the sound a man makes when he has been caught entirely off guard by something he cannot help finding admirable, and is surprised to find himself caught. "Who is she?" he said. "I have no idea," I said. He straightened. He uncrossed his arms. He said, "Find out." I found out from the innkeeper, which took about 4 minutes and cost me a shilling and the full expenditure of the man's inclination to keep his opinions to himself, which turned out not to be very large. He was the kind of man who enjoyed knowing the business of a small community and was pleased, when given the opportunity, to demonstrate the breadth of his knowledge. He told me everything I asked, and a considerable amount I hadn't, with the fluency of someone who has been narrating this particular story in his own mind for some time, and is glad of a proper audience at last. Her name was Miss Eleanor Ashworth, eldest daughter of Sir Clement Ashworth of Merton House, a baronet who had been slowly and comprehensively ruined over the course of a decade by a combination of bad investment in a shipping venture, a lawsuit over a water right that had dragged on for 9 years, consuming legal fees year after year, and the accumulated weight of a series of smaller disasters, a roof, a harvest, a boundary dispute. A year when everything went wrong at once, and nothing went right the year after. Sir Clement was now in very poor health. The innkeeper described it as a decline of the chest and spirits, which was his way of communicating that the man had been ground down not just physically, but in the more fundamental sense, the kind of wearing away that happens when a person watches something they built slowly coming apart and cannot stop it. He had signed over his remaining assets to discharge his debts, including, and here the innkeeper lowered his voice slightly, less from discretion than from theatrical instinct, his eldest daughter's hand in marriage to Baron Strachey of Dunwich, in exchange for the discharge of the principal debt. The arrangement was, as the innkeeper put it, the old kind, the kind they don't do much openly anymore, but nobody has actually said it cannot be done, legally speaking. "The primary debt," I said, "not the full amount." "Right," he said, with obvious appreciation for my quickness. "Primary debt only, and Miss Ashworth has been fighting on the secondary debts for near a year now, ever since she understood what her father had agreed to. Baron Strachey wants them included in the discharge, so he gets the girl and considers the whole business closed with nothing further owing. She's saying they have to be assessed separately and paid additionally, which means he'd have to spend considerably more than he planned, and which also means the longer she can delay the assessment, the longer the instrument can't be properly executed." "She's been stalling him," I said. "Very cleverly, the innkeeper said with what sounded like genuine respect. Very, very cleverly, and she's been running out of time. He's been pressing harder in the last 2 months. Does she want to marry him? I said. The innkeeper looked at me with the expression of a man who has been asked a question with an answer so obvious he is uncertain whether the questioner is serious. She's 22, sir. He's 56. She's met him twice, once at the initial discussion and once when he came to assess the property, and by all accounts on the second occasion she needed to ask his secretary to confirm his name because she'd failed to retain it from the first. He runs his 3 households as if they were garrison quarters. What do you think? I went back to Marcus. I told him everything I had learned, in the order I had learned it, while we stood by the gate and the drizzle continued and the village went about its business around us. He listened without expression, which was his way, and which I had learned long ago was not disengagement but the opposite of it. When a man shows you everything he is thinking, he is processing it for you. When he shows you nothing, he is processing it for himself. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. In the solicitor's doorway, the dispute had apparently moved inside. The door was now closed, but the window was open an inch, and we could hear the muffled shape of exchanges from within. What is the primary debt? He said. I didn't get the figure. Get it? It cost me another shilling, and a quarter-hour of careful conversation with a young man at the farrier's who turned out to have a cousin employed at Fells's office, and who was willing to exercise family loyalty in exchange for what I implied was professional interest rather than personal curiosity. The figure I came back with was specific and I thought moderately surprising, not for its size, which was substantial for a ruined baronet but entirely manageable for a duke, but for the fact that the whole arrangement had been made over so comparatively modest a sum. The secondary debts, by the preliminary accounting Miss Ashworth had commissioned, were not enormous either. Marcus took in the figures I gave him, and said nothing for a long moment. He was watching the closed door of the solicitor's office. Something was occurring in that room, we could hear it in the muffled tones, the occasional louder syllable, and he was watching the door with the particular stillness he used when he was deciding whether to enter a situation. Do you know what I was doing at 22? He said. Betting on horses and losing at cards, I said, because it was accurate and he knew I knew it. Badly, he agreed. He was almost smiling in the way he almost smiled, the version that lives at the corner of the mouth and never quite completes. She has been managing her father's financial collapse for 11 months, alone. It would appear so. She read her own contract. She identified the specific clause. She had an independent accountant commissioned 3 weeks ago specifically to build the argument she used this morning. She anticipated every step of today, I said. He looked at me sideways. She's been running out of time, she knew it. She prepared for it anyway. A pause. That is a particular kind of courage. He was quiet again. The coachman was visible at the far end of the yard, deep in conversation with the farrier over the wheel fitting, and the 2 outriders were drinking something warm from mugs by the stable door. We had perhaps another 20 minutes. Then Marcus said, I am going to go in there. I looked at him. Marcus, I want to speak to the Baron. You don't know these people. I know this type of arrangement. His voice was flat and very precise in the way it got when he had made up his mind about something, and was in the process of explaining it to me as a courtesy rather than for consultation. A debt structured around a woman's agreement. The primary sum discharged, the secondary left ambiguous, the girl pressured to concede before the accounting is complete, so the total obligation appears smaller and she has less standing to hold out. I've seen it before. A pause in which something moved across his face that was older and more particular than professional judgment, the expression of a man accessing a specific memory rather than a general principle. My mother's first engagement was arranged the same way. She was 24. She did not get out of it. I had not known that. He had never said it in 31 years. There were, I supposed, things that length of friendship still left in shadow, things that are not hidden but are simply carried privately and produced only when the occasion makes them relevant. He walked across the yard and opened the door of B. Fell's, solicitor without knocking. I followed him because I had been following Marcus Aldrich Vane into rooms he had no business entering since we were both 17 years old in the same regiment, and the habit was too old and too practiced, and if I am honest, too reliable in its outcomes to break now. The interior of the solicitor's office was small and smelled of tallow and old paper, and the particular, distinctive damp of a building that has been permitting weather in through its east wall for longer than its owner has yet addressed. There was a desk of the solid, permanent type, 3 chairs arranged with the efficiency of a room where comfort is secondary to function, a set of shelves that bowed slightly under the weight of ledgers arranged by year, and a window with a cracked pane patched with a piece of oilcloth that had clearly done the job for at least 2 winters and would manage a third. Miss Ashworth was standing on one side of the desk, the leather case she had been carrying at her feet, a document in her hand. Baron Strachey and his secretary were on the other side. Mr. Fells was behind it with a quill in his hand, and the expression of a man who is professionally responsible for a situation he did not engineer and cannot resolve. They all looked at us. Marcus took in the room without appearing to the quick, thorough assessment of a man accustomed to walking into situations he did not create. Then he said, with pleasantness so complete it was almost puzzling, "Forgive the interruption. My name is Halvenmere. I wonder if I might have a word." Baron Strachey assessed the interruption with the eyes of a man who operates through social weight and was now applying it. He took in the coat, the bearing, the quality of the boots, the way Marcus had entered the room, not tentatively, not aggressively, but with the simple certainty of a man who has never had cause to wonder whether he belonged in a room. He came to the correct calculation. He said, with a careful resettling of his own considerable weight, "What is this regarding, Your Grace?" "The instrument currently under discussion," Marcus said. He moved to the window, placing himself between the Baron and the solicitor in a way that looked like he was simply seeking the light and was not. "I couldn't help but overhear the earlier exchange. Thin walls." He glanced at the oilcloth patch on the window pane as if it fully explained the building's acoustic properties. "The Ashworth matter." "This is a private negotiation," the Baron began. "Entirely," Marcus said, with an agreeableness so thorough it was impossible to object to. "I have no interest in its private dimension. I have an interest, as it happens, in the secondary accounting, which I understand has not been completed. Mr. Fells," and here he addressed the solicitor directly, with the manner of a man who expects to be answered and has never not been, "would you be able to tell me the current best estimate of the outstanding secondary debts? The figure that appears in the preliminary accounting Miss Ashworth commissioned, specifically." Mr. Fells looked at the Baron looked at Marcus. The calculation this time was very brief. A Baron and a Duke in a small room in a village on a Tuesday, and only one of them had 3 dukedoms worth of land in the north, a seat in the cabinet, and a look about him that suggested he was not going to be moved by anything that had failed to move him so far, and then Mr. Fells told him the figure. Precisely, including the range of the disputed secondary items, because Miss Ashworth's preliminary accounting had been thorough enough to establish a range rather than a single number, and Mr. Fells had absorbed enough of this morning's proceedings to understand that precision was the appropriate register. Marcus nodded. He produced a small notebook from his coat, a habit from the army that he had never abandoned, the small leather notebook with the pencil in the spine, and he wrote the figure down with the unhurried certainty of a man recording information he intends to use. Then he looked at Baron Strachey and said, with the same pleasantness he had since he walked in, "I would like to purchase the debt. The primary sum and all secondary amounts, the full accounting completed today, settled in full in cash by bankers draft to this office." There was a silence. It was the silence of a room in which several people have had to rapidly reorganize their understanding of what kind of morning they are having. Miss Ashworth's chin, which had been absolutely, precisely level throughout everything, throughout the doorway and the argument and every exchange I had witnessed, adjusted. Very slightly. The fraction of a degree that indicates a person has received something they had stopped expecting to receive. It was the first involuntary movement I had seen her make, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds before the composure settled back over it. But I saw it. Baron Strachey said, with the careful precision of a man buying time while he recalculates, "The purchase of a debt, that is not what this instrument is designed to contemplate." "The instrument," Marcus said, with a patience so extreme it had passed through courtesy and come out the other side as something almost serene, "is a contract of marriage contingent on debt discharge. If the debt is discharged by another party, the contingency is satisfied. The marriage contract fails for want of its founding condition." He paused briefly. "That is my initial reading." Miss Ashworth, and here he looked at her directly, with the full, deliberate quality of his attention. For the first time, is that you're reading as well? She looked back at him. I watched her apply to him the same process she had applied to the Baron's arguments. Quick, structural, honest, looking for what the thing actually was rather than what it appeared to be. It took perhaps 3 seconds. She said, "It depends on the specific wording of the marriage instrument. Have you read it?" "Not yet." "Then I would recommend reading it before committing to a legal position," she said, not unkindly, just accurately. There was a beat in the room. Then Marcus said, "May I read it?" She held it out to him. He took it. He read it not performatively quickly, not deliberately slowly for the room's benefit, just at his actual reading pace, which was deliberate and complete, the pace of a man who reads to understand rather than to demonstrate. He finished. He handed it back. He said, "You're right. There is a restricting clause in subsection 3 that limits the debt discharge interpretation. It would need to be read alongside the primary deed of arrangement." She had already found the primary deed. It was in her leather case, of course it was. The case contained every document she might conceivably need, organized in the way of someone who had learned through hard experience that the document you have not brought is always the one that matters. She held it out to him without comment or explanation, which I noticed particularly. She did not explain what she was giving him. She gave it and waited. He read that one too. The room was very quiet while he did. Baron Strachey breathed steadily through his nose. His secretary looked at his pencil. Mr. Fels found something to examine in the middle distance. The rain moved quietly against the patched window. Marcus returned the deed. He said, "The restricting clause reads so discharged as to satisfy the full instrument, not discharged by the Baron, not discharged by the creditor named herein. If the debt were satisfied in full by any qualifying party, the founding condition of the marriage instrument would be met. The marriage contract would close." He paused and then, more slowly, "Subsection 4 contains a grace clause. 48 hours from the date of the final accounting, within which a counterparty discharge may be presented. You have been preventing the accounting from being finalized." "Yes," she said. "That was deliberate." "It was." The grace clause would permit someone to discharge the debt within that 48 hours, close the founding condition, and satisfy the full instrument, without executing the marriage portion. She said, "Is that a question, Your Grace?" He said, "It is a proposal." She said, "In exchange for what?" And that was the moment. I recognized it as such even at the time, standing in that small, damp room in Merton Croft with the rain at the window and Baron Strachey going slowly an interesting color of puce. The moment when Marcus looked at this young woman with the straight back and the mud-stained hem and the leather case full of prepared documents and the composure that had not shifted in an hour of considerable pressure, and said, "I haven't decided yet. May I have until tonight to consider it?" She said, "You have 48 hours from finalization. The finalization will occur today when Mr. Fels completes his accounting." She looked at the solicitor with a quality of expectation that was not exactly command, but was command's composed and courteous near relation. Mr. Fels, under that look, said, Yes, I believe I can." "By 6 o'clock this evening," she said. "By 6 o'clock," he agreed, with the manner of a man who would have agreed to 3 if she had pressed him. She looked back at Marcus. "You have from 6 o'clock tonight until 6 o'clock on Friday. That is your window if you choose to hold it." "And yours," he said. "Mine expired the moment you raised the possibility," she said it with the matter-of-factness that was both more and less devastating than drama would have been. "I have no other avenue. I have been waiting for one for 11 months. He nodded. He said, "I will call on you this evening, Miss Ashworth." "I am at Merton House. You are welcome to call." She said it with the composure of someone who is not going to allow herself to feel anything about this until she has had time to think about it properly. She picked up her leather case. She went out. Baron Strachey looked at Marcus for a long, assessing moment. "Then, Your Grace." Marcus said pleasantly, "Baron Strachey, I'll send word to your man in London when the accounting is settled. Good morning." We went out into the drizzle. Baron Strachey and his secretary came out behind us, less than a minute later, and the Baron said nothing to Marcus, which was both the correct decision and, I thought, a difficult one for a man of his temperament. His secretary had put away the pencil. They crossed the yard and got into a very good carriage and drove away in the direction of the main road, and the departure had the quality of something that has ended but does not know how to look like an ending. Mr. Fells appeared in the doorway of his office for a moment, with his ledgers, with the expression of a man who has just experienced something that will take him some time to fully process. He looked at Marcus, and then at the carriage departing, and then back at Marcus, and then he went inside and closed the door, and I had the impression that he was going to sit down very quietly for a few minutes before doing anything else. The farrier's boy had appeared at the gate of the yard and was looking at us with undisguised interest. The innkeeper was visible at the window of the inn with a cup of something, watching. The boy who had been sweeping the baker's step had stopped sweeping and was watching from across the lane. Marcus appeared to be entirely unaware of all of this. He was looking at the place where Miss Ashworth had been standing. I did not say anything until we had crossed the yard and reached the gate, and then I said, "You had decided before you walked in there." He was quiet for a long moment, longer than he usually took to answer a question, which was its own kind of answer. "I don't know when I decided," he said finally. "I know when I decided to go in. I don't know when I decided what to do once I was there." "The moment she handed you the primary deed without explaining it," I said. He looked at me sideways. "I was watching," I said. "She knew I would read it or I wouldn't," he said slowly. "She made her judgment about which it would be and she acted on it. She didn't hedge, she didn't explain." A pause. "That is not a common quality." "No," I said, "it isn't." The carriage was nearly ready. The coachman had finished his consultation with the farrier and was adjusting something about the wheel fitting with the confidence of a man who has diagnosed a problem correctly and knows how to address it. "I'm going to write to my aunt tonight," Marcus said. "About the debt? About the general matter?" I looked at him. "Say something more specific than that." He was quiet again for a moment in the drizzle with the village moving around us. Then, "I have not done anything impulsive in a very long time. 11 years at least." "Yes," he almost smiled. "I may be about to." "You may want to sleep on it first," I said. "I intend to call on her tonight," he said. "That is not a commitment, that is a conversation." I said, "From what I have just seen of her, I would not assume she considers those to be easily separable." He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "No, I don't suppose she does," and the almost smile became something slightly fuller, something that in any other man I would simply have called a smile. That's rather the point. We stayed at the inn in Merton Croft that night. Marcus did not tell me what he was thinking during the hours between the solicitor's office and dinner. He walked in the village lane for about 20 minutes after we had settled at the inn, which was something he did when he was working through a problem that had more variables than he was comfortable holding simultaneously. When he came back in, his coat was damp, and his expression was the expression of a man who has reached a series of preliminary conclusions and is not yet ready to discuss them. He ordered food and ate it without any apparent awareness of what it was. He read or held a book open and looked at it, which is not the same thing, for an hour without turning a page. At one point he got up and looked out the window at the village lane for several minutes and then sat back down. After dinner he said, "I am going to call on her." "I know," I said. "You don't have to come." "I know that too." "But you're coming." "Of course I am." Merton House was about a mile from the village, down a lane that had been lovely once and was still handsome in the manner of things that have been very good, and are now simply good old trees that knew what they were doing. A decent stone wall that had been mended in the right places, a gatehouse with a light in it, and a boy of about 12 who opened the gate for us without being asked and without particular surprise, which suggested either that the household was expecting callers tonight, or that the gatehouse boy had the instincts of a professional. The house itself was a medium-sized stone manor, probably Jacobean, with the proportions and the weight of a building that was designed to last, and had done so. It had clearly been well maintained once, recently and thoroughly, and was now in the condition of a thing being maintained with extreme care on insufficient resources. The windows were clean, the steps swept, the gravel of the drive raked, but the paint on the east wing was flaking where 2 winters had got under it, and the cornice above the main door had a piece missing that had been noted. You could see where it had been noted, the stub of the original molding, and not yet replaced. 2 of the chimneys had new mortar patching that had not quite matched the old stone. The garden walls were sound, but the beds within them were disciplined rather than abundant. The gardening of someone who knows what needs attending to and attends to exactly that. I thought about Miss Ashworth and her leather case of prepared documents, and the accountant commissioned 3 weeks in advance, and the clause in subsection 3 that she had identified and memorized and used at precisely the right moment. Someone had been keeping this house standing through years of declining resources and shrinking possibility. Someone had been making choices, year by year and season by season, about what to mend first and what could hold another year. We were shown in by an elderly manservant who had clearly been at Merton House for a very long time and had every intention of remaining. He had the carriage of a man whose loyalty is not a sentiment but a conviction, the kind that does not require articulation and does not diminish in difficult years. He showed us to a drawing room that was comfortable and cold. The fire had been lit but not long ago, which spoke to either the economies of a household that does not heat rooms until they are needed, or the expectation of callers tonight, or both, and furnished in the solid, good, slightly unfashionable way of a house that had purchased its furniture when purchasing furniture well meant buying things that would last, and had been right about that at least. Miss Ashworth came in perhaps 5 minutes later. She was in a different dress from the morning, a dark blue wool, plain and of good quality, the kind of dress chosen for what it is rather than what it conveys. Her hair was down from the bonnet and pinned with more care than it had been for the village, but still simply. She had settled, in the hours since the solicitor's office, into whatever state she had reached about the events of the day, and the state was a kind of resolution, not relief, not distress, but the quality of a person who has looked clearly at her situation as it now stands and made her decision about how to face it. She said, "Your Grace, Colonel Lorne." She had asked the manservant for names, evidently. She was not a woman who left that kind of thing to chance. "Please sit down. Would you take tea?" We took tea. It was good tea, properly made, served in china that had a small chip on one saucer, carefully placed on the outside, and was otherwise impeccable. Marcus said, "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me nothing," she said, with the precision of a woman being accurate rather than modest. "You raised a possibility today that may or may not come to anything formal. Until it does, you are under no obligation. I want to explain what prompted it." She folded her hands in her lap and gave him the particular waiting attention that I had seen her give the solicitor when he was about to explain something she already knew. Engaged, patient, not offering assistance, letting him say it in his own way. He said, "I have spent 20 years in various kinds of negotiation. Treaty work in the first years, parliamentary business, the management of a large estate and all the legal arrangements that entails." He paused. "I know what it looks like when someone has been working very hard at a problem for a long time alone with inadequate resources and has just run out of time." Another pause, shorter. "I know what it looks like when someone is losing and knows it and has not stopped trying." She was very still. "You have been managing this since your father fell ill," he said. "Since 14 months before he fell ill," she said. "The decline was gradual. There was a period before it became obvious, before even he was fully aware of it, when the letters were going unanswered and the decisions were being deferred. I began taking over the correspondence in the spring of 2 years ago because it was necessary, and I never stopped. Alone. We have a land agent, Mr. Griggs. He is 81 years old. He was excellent at his work 20 years ago, and he does everything within his current capacity, which is not nothing." She paused. "We have Mr. Fells, as you have now had occasion to observe." She said it without bitterness, which was its own kind of precision. "What happened to the secondary debts?" he said. "Tell me the whole of it." She told him. It took about 20 minutes, and she told it with the same quality she had brought to the legal argument in the solicitor's doorway. Clear, sequential, free of self-pity, making sure the structure was visible so the listener could understand the shape of the thing rather than only its emotional weight. The investment in the shipping venture, which had looked sound in the 3rd year and failed catastrophically in the 4th. The lawsuit over the water right with the neighboring property, which had been initiated over a legitimate grievance, and had then developed a life of its own, consuming in legal fees year after year what it had originally been brought to preserve. The east wing roof that had given way in a bad January and cost twice the initial estimate to repair, partly because the underlying timber had been compromised longer than anyone had realized. The year the harvest failed, and the year after when the fencing on the south quarter gave way during a wet summer, and there had been an indemnity claim from the neighbor over the cattle. The slow, grinding accretion of specific disasters, each survivable individually, collectively not. She did not present it as suffering. She presented it as a series of facts with a consequent condition, the way a surveyor presents the condition of a building. This is what happened, this is what it cost, this is where things stand. I found it, in its precision and its completeness, more affecting than suffering would have been. When she finished, Marcus said, "The Baron's offer, when was it made originally?" 8 months ago, my father accepted in October. And you knew about it when? September. I learned he was considering it in September and began working to prevent it at once. She looked at her tea for a moment. My father does not always follow the full argument of a legal or financial matter. There is a quality to his thinking now that is not the same as it was. He saw the debt discharged. He saw the estate preserved. He saw a household for me. She stopped and then said more carefully, "He loves me." He looked at the situation and believed he was providing for me. The resolution he chose was not the resolution I would have chosen, but the intention behind it was he was not cruel. I want that to be clear. It is clear, Marcus said. What did he say when you told him you were fighting it? A beat. He didn't know I was fighting it, she said. He had agreed to it. I told him the accounting was taking some time, and that was true. I did not tell him I was the reason it was taking time. There was a pause. Marcus looked at her for a moment without speaking, and she did not fill the pause or explain it further. He said, "I am going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer." "Then ask it," she said. "If I discharge the full debt, the primary sum and every secondary amount, the full accounting settled, the marriage instrument to Strachey closes. You are free of it. What is your actual situation after that? Not what you hope for, what it is." She was quiet for a moment, ensuring accuracy. Then, a house that is heavily mortgaged, a father who requires regular medical attention and who is not well enough to manage his own affairs, a land agent who is 81 years old, an income from the land that has been insufficient for several years and will continue to be insufficient without proper investment. No prospects that I know of. And the estate itself, the land, the house, the timber, the south quarter you mentioned, what is its actual condition? She looked at him with the slight quality of reassessment that I had noticed before, checking whether he actually wanted to know this or was being politely thorough. She appeared to decide he wanted to know. The estate could be managed profitably, she said, with proper capital and proper management over the next 5 years. I know what it needs because I have spent 2 years learning it. She paused. The soil in the south quarter is well suited to root vegetables. It has the right composition and the right depth, but it needs proper drainage, which requires only a modest adjustment to the existing slope that has not been made in 30 years. The North Wood has sufficient timber volume to support a managed cycle that would produce income within 20 years and sustainable yield indefinitely. I have made contact with a timber merchant in Aldwick who has expressed interest in the right. The water right dispute, which has consumed legal fees for 9 years, is entirely supportable in law. I have researched it thoroughly. The documentary evidence on our side is clear, and a competent barrister could resolve it in 6 months. The house itself is sound. The east wing roof is sound. With proper capital and someone competent to manage it, the estate would support a household of 3 very comfortably within 5 years. She stopped. She looked at him steadily. You are not asking about the estate. I'm asking, he said, whether you know this estate the way you know a legal document, whether the knowledge is yours worked out through your own effort. Yes, she said, it is. Then you are at present the most important thing about the estate. The knowledge is in you. Yes, she said, with the equanimity of a person acknowledging a fact about the weather, a fact she has accepted and does not require sympathy for. He was quiet for a moment. The fire had found its full strength now and was warming the room properly. The rain had settled into the steady murmur of a night in which it is going to rain until morning, and has accepted this. What do you want from this? He said. Not what you will take, what you want. She considered this with real attention, the way she appeared to consider everything, not performing deliberation but actually doing it. I want the debt discharged, she said. That is the foundational thing. I want my father in his own house with proper care for as long as he needs it. I want the estate to be what it could be. I have been watching it diminish for 2 years, knowing exactly what it would take to stop the diminishment and prevent it, and lacking the resources to do it. She paused. And I want not to be transferred from one arrangement to another in which I have no voice and no standing. That would not be what I am proposing, he said. You have not told me what you are proposing. I want to explain it fully, he said, and I want you to have the complete picture before I do. He looked at his hands for a moment, an unusual gesture from him, one I had seen before only in the preparation for things he considered important enough to say exactly right. My wife died 4 years ago. There are no children. I am 39 years old. I have an estate that is managed well, and I have been told twice a year for 4 years that I ought to remarry. He looked up. I have found the prospect of searching in London, the expected process, the social rounds, entirely uninteresting. Not difficult, uninteresting. There has been nothing in it worth attending to. She said, and this is different. You are different, he said, with a flatness that was, I thought, the most direct thing he had said about his own experience to another person in a very long time. The situation is practical. I do not believe in obscuring practical matters with decorative language. You need the debt cleared and a household that does not require you to spend every year managing a collapse. I need someone at my table who will tell me when my argument is wrong. That is a lower bar than it sounds. She said, Are you proposing a marriage of convenience, Your Grace? I am proposing, he said, that we discuss it, tonight and over the next few days before either of us commits to anything. I am aware that you have spent 11 months fighting your way out of exactly such an arrangement, and I do not want to simply be another version of that. I want your honest assessment of whether you could consider it, not whether you could endure it, whether you could actively consider it. She said, Then tell me specifically what you are proposing, every term. He said, The full debt discharged today by banker's draft, once the accounting is finalized as you have arranged. Your father remaining at Merton House with adequate care provided from the estate, I would ensure proper medical attendance and household support, not merely adequate but genuinely good care. A proper steward engaged for Merton, someone competent, someone you would help to select because you know the property and its needs better than anyone, and your judgment on candidates would be more reliable than mine. You would come to Halvenmere as my Duchess. He said the title plainly, without weight or flourish. You would have your own rooms at Halvenmere, your own income, a sum sufficient for genuine independent means, not an allowance but a settled income, yours regardless of anything else. Your own correspondence, your own affairs, managed as you see fit. You would not be required to manage my household unless you chose to, and you would not be required in any respect or dimension that you have not specifically agreed to in advance. A pause. I do not require an heir. I have a cousin, a man I respect, who would inherit if the line ends with me. He would manage the estate differently than I would, but not incompetently. If that calculus changes for either of us, it would be a separate conversation, fully agreed upon, or it would not occur. There was a long silence. She said, You have described what you would provide. You have not said what you want from it. A companion, he said. Someone at the table who reads correctly and says what she thinks. She looked at him for a long time. The fire settled in the grate. The rain moved at the window. The elderly manservant was somewhere overhead in the house, going through the last small tasks of a Tuesday evening, unhurried and reliable. She said, I want to read any instrument before I sign it. Of course. I want to speak to my father before I agree to anything. Of course. And I want 3 days, she said. Not 48 hours, 3 days from tonight. The accounting completed tomorrow morning and 2 full days after that to think. He said, The grace clause window in the instrument is 48 hours. The grace clause window is yours to hold open, she said. Mine is whatever I decide it to be. If you agree to the 3 days, you hold it. If you do not agree, we have no further discussion and I will find another way. She said it without ultimatum in her voice, without pressure or drama, just the structure of the thing. I cannot make a decision of this kind in 48 hours and I will not. He said 3 days. She said, Thank you. He stood, I stood. She walked us to the door herself. The manservant had retired for the night, and at the door, just as Marcus reached for his hat from the stand, she said, Your Grace. He turned. Thank you, she said. For today, in the solicitor's office, whatever comes of all of this, that was not nothing, what you did. I want you to know that I know it. He said, No, it wasn't. We walked back in the rain. In the lane, in the dark, I said to him, Well, yes, he said. We walked a little further. You recognized her, I said, from the first moment. He considered this for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then, I recognized what she was doing, he said. What it costs, holding a line that long alone with no real prospect of winning because it's the right line to hold. A pause. I have done it in different circumstances. I know what it looks like from the outside. And the rest, I said, the rest of what you recognized. He was quiet for a long moment more. The village was dark and still around us, the inn light ahead. Not yet, he said, but he said it in a way that meant in time. The accounting was completed by 9 o'clock the following morning. Miss Ashworth had evidently spoken to Mr. Fells the previous evening, after we had left Merton House, and made the deadline clear in terms that apparently admitted no ambiguity. I learned the details later, from the young man at the farrier's, who had upgraded his information substantially now that the story had become more interesting. She had stayed at Fells's office until nearly midnight working through the disputed secondary ledger entries alongside the solicitor himself, resolving the 2 items that had been unclear, so that when Mr. Fells arrived at his office at 8 the following morning she was already there. She had apparently arrived before him, with the disputed figures settled, a completed summary on his desk, and a pot of tea she had brought from the inn because she had not been certain the office would have won. Marcus received the final figure by private messenger at 10 o'clock. He read it, nodded, and made a brief calculation in his small notebook. Baron Strachey received the same figure at roughly the same time and sent a letter to the inn addressed to Marcus, which arrived while we were at breakfast. Marcus read it and passed it to me without comment. It was not threatening, precisely. It was the letter a man writes when he has decided to be gracious about an unfortunate development in a way that makes absolutely clear what his forbearance is costing him, and what the implied alternative would be. It outlined the prior claim, the existing arrangement, the investment of time and travel the Baron had made in good faith, and it suggested that a peer of Marcus's standing would naturally wish to reflect carefully on the propriety of inserting himself into a private arrangement that had been in progress for some months, and would perhaps find, on reflection, that his interest in the matter was less compelling than it had appeared in the moment of the previous day. It was well constructed, it was entirely futile. The author might have known this if he had studied Marcus, rather than simply assessing his rank. Marcus ate his breakfast. He ordered more coffee. He said, "I'm going to call on her this morning. Are you coming?" We went. She was in the walled kitchen garden behind the house when we arrived, not as a young lady at leisure in pleasant surroundings, but working. She was kneeling by a section of the parsnip bed in leather gloves that were too large for her hands, doing something with the soil around the young plants that appeared to involve loosening it with a narrow-hand tool, with the focus and economy of someone who considers this task important and does not intend to do it insufficiently. She heard us on the garden path before we reached her and rose at once, pulling off the gloves, and said, "Good morning." She looked from Marcus to me and back in the quick assessing way that was characteristic of her. "Is something wrong?" "The accounting is complete," Marcus said. "I have the final figure." "Yes," she said. "I know. I was there at 11 last night when we resolved the final disputed entry, and I checked the summary again at 8:30 this morning. The Baron has written to me." "I expected he would," she said, without surprise or particular interest. She tucked the gloves under her arm. She walked us to a bench in the corner of the walled garden, old wrought iron, solid, placed with the long view of a person who intended the bench to be used for a long time, with a view across the kitchen beds to the far corner where a pear tree stood, just at the edge of its early blossom, the white flowers tentative and pale against the gray spring sky. She sat down and folded her hands in her lap and said, "What did he say?" "That I should reconsider," Marcus said. "And I have reconsidered," he said, "and my conclusion is the same as yesterday. I will discharge the debt this morning by banker's draft to Fells's office if you agree. The secondary accounting will be incorporated into the discharge instrument in full, and the marriage instrument to Strachey will be closed this afternoon." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the pear tree. She said, "I spoke to my father last night when I returned from Mr. Fells's office." "How is he?" Marcus said. He was awake, which he often is not late in the evening. He understood about the accounting being finalized. I explained it carefully. He asked me if I was happy. She paused for a moment. The garden was very still. I told him that I had been given an unexpected alternative and that I was thinking about it very carefully and that the person who had offered it seemed to be acting in good faith. He asked me if the alternative was agreeable to me. I told him I didn't know yet, but that I was approaching it honestly. Another pause. He said, "You have always made sensible decisions, Ellie. I should have let you make this one to begin with." She stopped. She was looking at the pear tree, and her voice was entirely steady. And I understood that the steadiness was the result of a deliberate decision, and that what it was steadying over was something she had not entirely expected to feel as much as she did. "He has not called me Ellie since I was 12 years old," she said. "It was a good conversation, the best we have had in a considerable time." Marcus said quietly, "And your decision?" She turned from the pear tree and looked at him. I noticed it again, the brown eyes, very attentive, containing a great deal of what she was not saying. She said, "You told me last night that you want someone at your table who reads properly and says what she thinks." "Yes. I want you to understand what that actually means," she said. "I have been told, across several years and by more than one person, that I argue too precisely and place too much weight on the specific wording of things and make insufficient allowance for the personality and preferences of the person I am dealing with." She paused, and the not-quite smile was there again, the ghost of one. "I have been told this by Mr. Fells, by my father's solicitor in London, by two of my father's creditors, by the water-right neighbor's man, and by a well-meaning aunt who suggested I would get further if I were less particular about being correct. It is possible they have a point." "I was in the solicitor's doorway," Marcus said. "I heard how you argue. And I heard someone who was entirely right about the legal instrument," he said. "In every specific she named, including the ones I verified myself afterward." He paused. "I do not find precision inconvenient." "You would have to actually listen when I tell you something is wrong," she said. "Not simply agree and then do the thing you were already going to do." "I usually listen," he said. "Usually," she said. "Not always." "No," he said. "Not always. I would need you to tell me when the sometimes had become a pattern, to tell me directly, not to manage around it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "just that." He said, "You accept." She said, "I accept, on the terms as stated last night, with the addition that any amendment to those terms would require agreement from both of us in writing, which we both sign." He almost smiled. "I would not have it any other way." She was quiet a moment. The pear tree dropped a single blossom in the quiet of the garden, carried sideways by the faintest movement of air. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Tell me." "I am grateful," she said. "I am deeply, specifically grateful for everything, for the intervention yesterday, for the offer, for the terms as you have described them. I use the word carefully, and I mean it fully." She looked at him. "But I am not only grateful. I want to be clear about what else I am and what I cannot offer, because I think honesty at the beginning matters more than it is comfortable to admit." She paused. "I am practical. I know what a marriage of convenience is and what it is not. I will be a good duchess. I will manage whatever is asked of me and be honest at your table and read every document you put in front of me and tell you when the clause is wrong. But I cannot offer you certainty about what I feel." She held his gaze with a steadiness that was both honest and, I thought, rather brave. "Not at 2 days' acquaintance. Whatever I might feel in the future, I don't know. And I want you to know that I don't know, so that later, if things are not what anyone anticipated, we both know I was honest with you at the very beginning." He said with the same care she had brought to it, "I am not asking for certainty." "I know," she said. "I want to be clear about it anyway." "Then we are clear," he said. She nodded. She picked up her gloves from beside the bench. She said, "One more thing." He waited. "The water right dispute," she said. "The neighbor, Mr. Halford of Crestwick, you said last night that you know his father." "In the house," Marcus said, "yes. We have sat on the same committee for 7 years. The dispute has run 9 years because Mr. Fells was afraid of the man and my father could not press the matter, and I have not had leverage he was required to respect." She said it without resentment, just the mechanics of it. "I have the documentary evidence. I have researched the title chain thoroughly. I am correct in law. I cannot make him acknowledge it." Marcus said, "He will hear from me this week." She looked at him for a moment, that same reevaluation look, the recalculation of a set of figures she thought she had established. "That is very kind," she said. "Both," he said, "kind and practical. The distinction is not always as large as people suppose." She looked at him a moment longer, and then she looked down at the gloves in her hands, and then at the pear tree, and I had the clear impression of a woman revising an estimate. Between that April morning in the walled garden and the wedding in June there were 8 weeks, and I have been condensing for the sake of proportion, but I do not want to pass over them as though they were simply time. They were not simply time. They were the weeks in which the arrangement became what it actually was, rather than what either of them had agreed to in the walled garden with the pear tree blossoming, and the drizzle past, and the day still legible on both of them as something they had not expected when they woke that morning. I want to tell you about a specific afternoon in May, because it is the kind of thing that does not fit neatly into any account of the formal proceedings, but that says more about the shape of those weeks than the formal proceedings do. We were at Merton House for the betrothal announcement. In the afternoon between the announcement luncheon and the evening dinner, Marcus found himself with 3 hours and no particular obligation. Alina was occupied with her aunts, the two who had arrived from somewhere in Hampshire with the expressions of women making up for lost time, and with the various social requirements that an announcement generates, and Marcus had been excused from these for the afternoon on the basis that he had a letter to write. He did not write the letter. Instead, after perhaps 20 minutes at the desk in the borrowed study, he went out to the walled kitchen garden. I know this because the boy at the gatehouse told me afterward, with the enthusiasm of someone who has witnessed something interesting, that the new Duke had spent about an hour and a half in the kitchen garden with the head gardener looking at the parsnip beds, the south wall, and the pear tree. That the new Duke had apparently measured the pear tree in some way, using his walking stick as a reference, and made notes in a small notebook. That the head gardener, old Burrows, who had been at Merton for 30 years and was not easily impressed, had, by the boy's account, seemed pleased. Marcus did not mention this afternoon to me. He mentioned it to Alina. Alina told me about it later, with the careful neutrality of someone describing something they are not yet certain how to classify. She said he measured the pear tree. I said I heard. She said he was calculating whether it could be transplanted to Halvenmere without damage. He spoke to Burrows about the root system. She paused. He said the variety was worth preserving. He mentioned the tree in a letter to me, I said. She looked at me with the slight adjustment of expression that I had come to recognize as her processing something that had moved her. She said, he mentioned it in a letter. Several letters, I said. Yours, in some ways, was the shorter account. She looked away briefly at the garden wall. Then she said with the precision she brought to everything, I believe I have been underestimating the degree to which I was already. She stopped, started differently. The pear tree was my mother's. She planted it the year before I was born. A pause. He didn't ask me about it. He simply looked into it. She said nothing else on the subject. She did not need to. The formal arrangements required what they required. The banker's draft issued, and the discharge instrument executed. The Baron Strachus' formal communication through his London solicitor received, answered with courtesy and finality, and filed. The betrothal announced in the correct channels, which produced some comment and some raised eyebrows, and one dinner party at which Marcus was subjected to what amounted to an interrogation by 3 of his parliamentary colleagues, which he appeared not to notice. The marriage settlement drafted and reviewed, which Alina read herself, page by page, with the same attention she brought to every document, and in which she found 2 clauses she wished adjusted. One relating to the provision for her father, and one relating to the terms of her own independent income, and which were adjusted without discussion, because Marcus had written them with the expectation that she would read them, and he trusted her reading. The Halford water right matter resolved in 4 weeks. Marcus wrote 1 letter to old Halford in the house. A settlement was offered and accepted inside a month. When the resolution document arrived at Merton House, Alina read it herself and found a clause she wished reworded and had it reworded. Marcus, when I told him about this, looked as if he had expected nothing less. What I want to tell you about those 8 weeks is the shape of them. Marcus began writing more letters. Not more in number. He was a prompt correspondent and had always been, but more in length, more in care. To me, when I was in London for 3 weeks on my own affairs, he wrote letters that covered in sequence the management of Merton's South Quarter, the specific variety of parsnip best suited to the clay soil of Aldwick, the history of the water right dispute, and the specific language of the title deed that supported their position, and the progress of the new steward selection at Merton, which Alina was leading and about which she had firm views. At the end of one such letter, as a postscript, in the slightly different ink of a man who added it after he thought he was done, she told me this morning about the pear tree in the kitchen garden. The variety is apparently well suited to the north. She thinks it worth transplanting to Halvenmere when we go up. I believe she means the tree literally and not as a figure of speech, which I find I appreciate. I read that postscript 3 times, then I folded the letter and kept it. Alina wrote to me once in May, a short note of genuine courtesy thanking me for my company at Merton House, and for my discretion during a somewhat unconventional set of negotiations, which was, I thought, a masterly piece of understatement. She said she was finding the arrangements thus far to be conducted in good faith, and she hoped I would visit when they were at Halvenmere. At the bottom of the letter, below her signature, she had added in a slightly different hand, "I would value your honest opinion of him. I think you have one." I wrote back that I intended to visit, that the arrangements would prove to be more than good faith in my estimation, and that my honest opinion of him was that he was one of the finest people I knew, and that I had known him 30 years, and had not found occasion to revise that view. She wrote back, "That is a very direct answer, Colonel Lorne," and then below the signature again in that slightly different hand, "I am glad." There were dinners. There were the kinds of social occasions that surround a betrothal announcement in that world. Not the formal dinners, which were manageable, but the informal ones, the ones at which people who know the man make assessments of the woman and communicate them to each other with the efficiency of a well-run intelligence operation. Marcus endured these with the same patience he applied to anything he considered necessary and not particularly interesting. Alina attended them with a composure so thorough that I occasionally wondered whether she was aware that she was being assessed, and then I would see the slight adjustment in her attention when she identified the actual question beneath the pleasantry, and I would understand that she was entirely aware and had simply decided that awareness did not require reaction. I watched her at the first of these dinners answer a question about the Aldwick County seat, a political question posed by one of Marcus's parliamentary colleagues as a test, disguised as a conversational topic, with an answer so specific and so accurate that the colleague looked at Marcus afterward with the expression of a man who has just discovered he had been testing the wrong person. I watched her at the second receive the veiled curiosity of a woman who had known Catherine and was measuring Alina against a standard that Alina had not been told she was being measured against, and navigate it with a precision that was not unkind and was entirely honest. She said, when pressed, that she understood she was following a woman who had been very much loved, and that she did not think this required her to be something she was not. The woman who had known Catherine was quiet for a moment and then said, "No, I don't suppose it does," and the quality of the silence afterward was the silence of a point conceded. Lady Cecily Vane came up to London from Devon for the dinner at the end of April, 3 days early, which was a statement of intention if not exactly a declaration. She is Marcus's aunt and was his mother's closest friend, and she has the kind of intelligence that operates through apparently casual attention. She asks questions that seem like social pleasantry and listens to the full answers with a completeness that is rare in anyone, rarer still in a room full of people. She is also, to her credit, almost never wrong about people, and she knows it and does not pretend otherwise. Alina sat across from her at dinner for 2.5 hours, and I watched it. It went like this. Lady Cecily asked Alina about Merton House, and Alina told her about Merton House. Not the social version, the real one, the south quarter and the water right and the drainage and the specific calculations she had made about what the estate could sustain. Lady Cecily asked her about the season, and Alina answered briefly, and with the apparent awareness that this was not the actual question. Lady Cecily asked her about her father, and Alina told her what was true about her father, including the parts that were not comfortable. At 11 o'clock, when the other guests had moved to the drawing room, Lady Cecily kept Alina at the table. I was at the end of the hall and heard none of it. I saw only that 20 minutes later Alina came out with the expression of a person who has had a conversation that was more direct than expected and found it, all things considered, clarifying. Lady Cecily came out 4 minutes after that and found me in the hallway. "She'll do," she said. That is a significant understatement, I said. She has read every document connected to the Ashworth estate and the debt arrangement and the marriage instrument and the Halvenmere settlement proposal, Lady Cecily said, and she is entirely correct in her assessment of all of them. I asked. She paused. She also has opinions about the Halvenmere North Wood management that she was kind enough to share when I pressed her, and she is entirely correct about those as well, though she has never seen the North Wood. She looked at me steadily. He argued more at dinner last week than he has in 4 years. I was beginning to think we had lost him. He has not been lost, I said. He has been waiting. He has been absent, she said. Which is worse? A man who is lost is at least looking. A man who is absent has stopped. She looked across the room, where Marcus was talking to someone about parliamentary procedure and appeared, for the first time in 4 years, to be actually present in the conversation rather than conducting it from a polite distance. She is the reason he is present tonight. Yes, I said. Good, said Lady Cecily, and went to refill her wine. At Merton Croft in May for the betrothal announcement, Marcus sat with Sir Clement after dinner. Elinor was at the pianoforte in the adjacent room. She had told Marcus, with complete cheerfulness, that she did not play well, that she had not practiced in 2 years, and that this was not something she was inclined to be embarrassed about. She was right on all 3 counts. She played with the enjoyment of someone who has been given permission, after a very long time, to do something imperfectly, because they want to rather than perfectly because someone requires it. Marcus sat with Sir Clement for an hour. I was there for the first quarter of it, and then found a reason to be elsewhere, because what was happening in that room was not something I needed to witness in full in order to understand it. In the quarter hour I was there, Sir Clement was tentative at first, as a man is tentative when he has made a serious error about his daughter's future and is uncertain of his standing with the person who corrected it. Marcus did not address this directly. He asked Sir Clement about the estate as it had been, not as it was, but in its good years, how it had looked when Sir Clement had been young and the land productive and the house full. Sir Clement talked. Cautiously at first, with the carefulness of someone who has not been asked this question in a long time, and is checking whether it is safe to answer it honestly, and then with more ease, and then with something that approached pleasure, the specific pleasure of a man who has been handed back a version of himself he thought he had lost access to. Marcus listened and asked questions that showed he was listening, and at some point he said something that made Sir Clement laugh. A real laugh, not the social variety, the kind that takes a person by surprise, and the old man had to put down his glass. In the parlor, the pianoforte struck a wrong note of some magnificence. Marcus glanced toward the doorway and smiled. Not the almost smile, the real one. The wedding was in June, at the old church in Halvenmere village, which has been the Vane family's church for 2 centuries, and has the proportions and the accumulated quiet of a place that has witnessed a very great deal and holds it all without comment. The morning was clear, the particular clear of a Yorkshire June that has earned it after a wet May, the light coming early and staying. There were perhaps 40 people in the church. Marcus's parliamentary colleagues, his cousin the heir who was a good man and who had written to Marcus a letter of such genuine warmth about the news that Marcus had shown it to me without comment, which was his way of being moved. 2 of Elinor's aunts who had not, by all accounts, been told of Elinor's situation until it was resolved, and who had arrived with the expressions of women who wished they had known sooner, and were not entirely sure what to do with that feeling. The land agent from Merton, old Mr. Griggs, who had driven down in a borrowed gig, and who sat in the second pew with the expression of a man witnessing a good outcome he had not believed in, and was revising his estimate of the world accordingly. Aldous the gardener, who was there because Elinor had asked him to be, and had written the invitation herself. Lady Cecily was in the front pew on Marcus's side, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and watching everything. Elinor came in on her father's arm. Sir Clement was in better health than anyone had expected to see him, a good month, his physician said, and the preparations and the occasion had seemed to do him well. He was wearing a new coat that fit him properly, which I was quite certain Marcus had arranged for him without saying so, through some mechanism involving a tailor and a trusted intermediary. He walked straight and carefully and with the expression of a man trying to do something he loves correctly. She was in ivory, simple, well-made, appropriate, and she walked with the same back she had had on the porch step in Merton Croft, perfectly straight, with the composed face that I had come to know as hers. attentive and collected, and occasionally, when something surprised it, illuminated. When she reached the front of the church and Marcus took her hand, she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and there was in that exchange the particular quality that I have witnessed, perhaps a handful of times in a long life of watching people. The quality of complete private understanding, made briefly visible, which is the rarest thing I know. It lasted 2 seconds, then the ceremony began. Afterward, at the reception at Halvenmere, Marcus's cousin found me first. He was a tall man in his late 40s, steady and thoughtful, and he shook my hand and said, "I was uncertain when I heard." He looked across the room, where Marcus was already moving toward Sir Clement to ensure the old man had company and a chair in a good position. "I'm not uncertain now." He paused. "He hasn't looked like that in 4 years." I said, "No, he hasn't." The cousin nodded and went to find his wife. Lady Cecily found me afterward, with a glass of wine and the expression of someone who has been proved right and is too self-possessed to say so with any emphasis. She looked at Marcus across the room, where he was standing in the corner with Sir Clement. "He has been there 40 minutes, she said. "I know," I said. "Elinor cannot be with her father and also receive the guests. He knows it. He is making sure Sir Clement is not left alone." She paused. "He never did that before, not for anyone, not without being asked." Sir Clement said something, and Marcus laughed, and Sir Clement's face opened and was, for a moment, entirely itself. "The thing about him," Lady Cecily said quietly to me alone, "is that he was always capable of this. He was always this man. He simply needed someone who required him to be it." I was not present for what I am about to tell you. Marcus told it to me over the course of the following year, in the way he tells things, not as a narrative offered, but as pieces produced when the occasion made them relevant, the way a man shares things when he has finally, after some time, decided he has permission to. The first time he understood the arrangement had become something different. August, Halvenmere, late evening. He had been out at the north fence all day, a section of posts that had been compromised over the winter and needed to be replaced rather than merely repaired, and then the question of the adjacent wall, and then an issue with the drainage channel that had to be addressed while they were out there. He came in late and muddy, and he had not sent word because he had forgotten, in the way of a man who has been doing physical work in good air all day and has simply not thought of it. He found Elinor in the library. She was at his desk. At the desk he worked at, with the lamp he used, surrounded by 3 of his estate ledgers, and a draft letter she appeared to be composing in connection with the Merton stewardship. She looked up when he came in and said, "You didn't send word." He said, "I forgot, I'm sorry." She said, "I was not worried." There was something in the way she said it, precise, careful, that told him she had been slightly, and was being accurate rather than dismissive about it. "There is dinner kept warm in the kitchen. Please sit down." He sat down. She went herself to get the dinner. It was past 11 and the household staff had retired hours ago, and came back with a tray, a covered plate, bread, the remaining half of a decent bottle of wine that had been opened for her dinner. She put it on the side table beside his chair without fuss and went back to the desk and her letter without ceremony. He ate, she wrote. The fire was good, and the room was warm, and outside the Yorkshire moorland was completely dark and very large, and making no demands on either of them. He sat there for about 20 minutes after he finished eating, reading nothing, while she wrote. It was not the comfortable silence of long habit. They had not had long habit yet, only a few months of it, and he was aware of every degree of the newness. It was something else. It was the silence of a room in which 2 people are each doing what they need to do, and neither of them is performing anything for the other. And that particular quality, its simplicity, its completeness, arrived in him as a kind of knowledge. Not a decision. He had apparently made the decision at some earlier point without noticing. Just the knowledge of it settling, that this was where he was and that he did not want to be anywhere else, and that this was not an arrangement he was managing. He thanked her for the dinner. She said of course and wished him good night without looking up from the letter. They went to their respective rooms. Nothing had changed. Everything had. Before September, there had been August in full, Halvenmere in the summer, which is not a gentle thing. The moors turn golden and the light goes on longer than seems reasonable, and the estate is at its fullest in the sense of requiring the most. The hay, the maintenance the summer allows, the accounts for the half-year, the preparations for autumn that must be made while summer is still present. Alina had moved into this with the same quality she brought to everything. She did not take it over from him, but she was there alongside it, and she had opinions about the Northwood timber assessment. She thought the current merchant was undervaluing the mature stand, and she had researched comparable sales, which she put in a document and left on his desk, and opinions about the arrangement of the household accounts, not critical opinions. Simply a suggestion about the classification system that would make year-on-year comparison cleaner, and no opinions at all about the aspects of his life that were not her business, which she appeared to identify with considerable accuracy. He told me in October, over a long walk on the estate, about the gradual quality of those summer weeks, not dramatic, not punctuated by any single event, but accumulating. The morning she had found the error in the window shutter on the east side before anyone else noticed it, and had it corrected before he knew it was a problem. The evening she had produced, without preamble, a set of calculations about the Northfield drainage that showed, quietly and irrefutably, that the current approach was costing considerably more in the long run than the alternative would cost up front. The afternoon he had been at his desk with a problem he was finding intractable, a correspondence matter with a tenant, complicated by a prior understanding that was not in writing, and she had come in to find a book and had seen, without being invited to look, the shape of it, and had sat down and said, "What is the prior understanding? Tell me from the beginning." And he had told her, and she had said, "Then you need to write the letter this way," and had explained what she meant, and she had been right. There was a quality to it, he said, on that October walk, with the moor going amber around us and the sky the particular Halvenmere blue that only happens in October. I kept expecting her to find the limit of it. The point at which the competence stopped and the difficulty began, the thing she couldn't manage or wouldn't. Every person has a limit. And I said, "And she kept not having one that I could find," he said. He said it with a simplicity that was not boastful. He was not talking about a competition, but was clearly something he had been sitting with for some time. Not in the things I could see, and I began to understand that this was its own kind of evidence about the things I couldn't. In September, she found the error in the land tenure amendment. He had been working on the reform for 2 months, and cared about it in the particular way he cared about things that were not merely administrative, but had a genuine effect on genuine people. He had left the draft on the library table. He worked in the library and left things on the table in the way of a man who trusts his own household. And Alina had read it without being asked, because she read whatever was on the library table. She told him about the error at breakfast the following morning, precisely and without preamble. The clause in subsection 7 that contradicted the stated intent of the principal reform, and would be used, if it got to committee, to defeat the entire section through a technical interpretation that would not require engaging with the substance of the argument. He looked at the clause, he looked at her, he said, "You're right." She said, "I know. It needs to be reworded before it goes anywhere." "I'll do it this afternoon," he said. "Good," she said, and reached across the table for the next section. He told me about this when he described September. He said, "I realized that morning that she had not been adjusting for me." "What do you mean?" "She had been treating me as if I were a problem that could be correctly stated and then correctly resolved," he said. "Not managing around me, not performing consideration of my feelings about being corrected, just working out what the situation actually was and responding to it, without allowance for what I might prefer the situation to be." "Is that unusual?" I said, though I knew the answer. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has been asked a question with an obvious answer. "It is exceptionally unusual," he said. He also told me about a morning in late September, a Saturday, when neither of them had any particular obligation. He had found her, when he came downstairs at 7, already in the garden, not the kitchen garden this time, but the formal garden to the south of the house, which had not been properly attended to for several seasons, and showed it. She was there with the head gardener, a man named Aldous who had been at Halvenmere for 23 years and whom Marcus trusted entirely. They were in the middle of a discussion about the south parterre that was, from what Marcus observed from the terrace, quite detailed. He went down to the garden. He arrived in time to hear Alina say to Aldous, "But the problem with the current arrangement isn't the plants themselves. It's the drainage channel behind the east bed, which is running at the wrong angle and backing up during heavy rain. If you correct the channel, you solve the parterre problem without disturbing anything else." She was looking at the bed in question with the same quality of attention she brought to ledgers, the structural assessment, finding the actual cause rather than the symptom. Has anyone looked at the channel specifically? Aldous said he had not in 23 years, and he was not sure when it had last been cleared. Elinor said, "Let's look at it now." Marcus, on the terrace, watched the two of them go around to the east side of the parterre and crouch down by the drainage channel, and Aldous say something that made Elinor nod, and Elinor say something that made Aldous make a sound of genuine professional acknowledgement. The sound of a man who has been working a problem for a long time and has been given the missing piece. He told me this in October on the walk on the moor. He said, "She has been looking at Halvenmere the way she looked at Merton House, finding what it needs." "Is that a problem?" I said. "No," he said, "it is not a problem at all." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the view. "It is the least like a problem of anything that has happened in 4 years." In October, she came in from the kitchen garden on a Tuesday afternoon. There had been a question about the drainage gradient from the steward at Merton, which she had answered in detail by letter, and she had come in muddy from checking the corresponding gradient at Halvenmere's south field, and she sat down across from him in the library and said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." "In April," she said, "when we spoke at Merton House, I told you I could not offer certainty about what I feel." He said, "I remember." She said, "I have more certainty now." He waited. "I have been attempting," she said, with the precise, careful quality she brought to everything she considered important, "to establish whether what I experience is gratitude or obligation or relief or some admixture of those things. Those are all things I have genuinely felt, and I can account for them specifically. Gratitude for the debt, gratitude for my father's situation, relief at the elimination of a particular future." She paused. "What I cannot account for under any of those headings is the fact that the best part of my day, without exception, is whatever part of it contains you." He said nothing for a moment. She said, "I have been told I do not express this kind of thing in the expected way." "Who told you that?" he said. "Several people, over several years. The underlying criticism was that I am too precise about things that are not meant to be precise." She looked at him steadily. "I thought they were correct. I am revising that." He said, "You express it with great clarity. It is precise rather than decorative, which is a different thing from doing it wrong." She looked at him. The composure that was her resting state was present, and underneath it was something that was not composure at all, something that was very much itself, specific and unhidden. He said, "I am glad it was you, Elinor." He used her name directly without preamble, and it was the first time he had done it, and they both knew it. "I am glad you were standing on that doorstep. I am glad you handed me the primary deed. I am glad you gave me 3 days." "So am I," she said, simply, completely, "now that I know what it was." "What was it?" he said. She looked at the rain beginning at the library window, the Yorkshire rain coming in from the moor that would last all evening. She said, "The beginning of being known." He reached across and took her hand. She looked at their hands and then up at him and gave it. "I am writing this in the January of their 2nd year together, in the library at Halvenmere, where the fire is good and the moor outside the window is pewter and gold in the flat winter light. The water right at Merton is settled. The south quarter drainage has been completed and is producing what Elinor said it would produce. The turnip crop was, by any measure, excellent. Sir Clement spent Christmas here and was in better spirits than his physician had dared to predict, and he and Marcus played chess on Christmas evening with the complete seriousness of men who are actually playing chess and intend to win. And at some point, Marcus said something that made the old man laugh until he had to set his king aside and compose himself. And I heard the laugh from the adjacent room and felt the quality of it, which was the sound of a man being simply glad. Elinor manages this household in the way she manages everything, with attention and precision and an efficiency that wears, as she has had more freedom and more rest and less crisis, a quality of genuine ease. She has her rooms, her desk as she likes it, her correspondence. She has a husband who came in last Tuesday to find her at the breakfast table with the morning letters and said, without preamble, "The Aldwych lease, 3rd page." She said, without looking up, "Subsection 4, the reversionary right, the wording is ambiguous." "I know," he said. He sat down. "What do you think?" She told him what she thought. He said she was right about the reversion and wrong about the timeline. She said she was right about both. He said they would see. She held up a specific line. He read it. He said, "You are right about both." He said it without drama, without difficulty, with the simple acknowledgement of a man who has genuinely listened and genuinely changed his view. She said, "I know." He looked at her across the breakfast table with the expression I have now observed on his face for more than 8 months and still find, somehow, striking. It is simply devoted. Entirely, without reservation or management or performance. The expression of a man who looks at what is in front of him and knows it to be, without qualification, the best thing in his life. She looked back in her way, quieter, more considered, contained and deliberate and entirely real. I excused myself from the breakfast table. There is an evening I have not mentioned, from the October of their first year, that I was not present for but that Alina told me about when I asked her, simply what she would say if she were telling the story herself. She said, "I would tell you about the evening he came in from the north fence." And I said, "He told me about that evening." She said, "I know." A pause. "What he told you was accurate as far as it went." She was quiet for a moment, with the quality of a person deciding how much to say. "What he did not tell you, because he does not know I noticed, is that he sat at the side table for 20 minutes after he finished eating and did not read anything or do anything, and neither did I. I was writing the letter. He was just there. And I was aware the whole time that he was there. And I was also aware that he was not performing being there, that he was simply in the room because it was the room he wanted to be in." She paused. "I have spent," she said carefully, "a considerable portion of my adult life in rooms where I was the person managing the situation, where my presence was functional, necessary, even valuable but functional, where the room worked better because I was in it, and that was the extent of it." She looked at me with the brown eyes that do not miss anything. That evening in the library was the first time in a very long time that I had the experience of being in a room because I wanted to be there, and of knowing that the other person was there for the same reason. A pause. "That is what I would tell you if I were telling the story. There is a morning I keep returning to, from the November of their first year together. I was staying at Halvenmere for a fortnight, some business of Marcus's that required my legal knowledge, and I was glad of the excuse to be there. I came downstairs early and found the library empty and the fire already built. The table had Marcus's current parliamentary work on one side and Alina's estate correspondence on the other, and between them, at the center of the table where they apparently both worked, a shared stack of documents that seemed to belong to both of them and neither of them specifically, the natural result of two people who have stopped keeping their work entirely separate. On the top of the stack was a note in Alina's handwriting. "The Crestwick Boundary Resolution, see paragraph 3. The language will need to be tightened before signing. I have marked it E. Underneath it, in Marcus's handwriting, shorter. Correct, I'll address it this morning, M." Two separate handwritings on the same piece of paper, going back and forth the way people go back and forth when they have been working together long enough that it no longer requires ceremony. I put the paper back exactly where I found it and went to ask for breakfast. Here is what I want to say before I finish, for the people who have asked me, who knew him before, who knew Catherine, who were uncertain about all of this, about its speed and its circumstances and its unconventional beginning, whether I think it has worked. It has worked in a way I did not predict in April, and could not have described then if I had tried. Whether it was right by whatever measure one applies to these things, it is the truest thing I have seen him do in 31 years of knowing him, and that seems to me to be the relevant measure. Alina Ashworth spent 14 months managing the ruin of a house she loved, on behalf of a father who could not do it himself, with resources that were never sufficient and a timeline that kept shrinking, and she did not put it down. She read every document. She commissioned the secondary accounting in advance. She stood on a porch step in the drizzle and refused to let a legal instrument close on incorrect terms, and she did it with complete composure, and she had been doing things like it, quietly and without acknowledgement, for 2 years before that. When Marcus arrived, which was an accident of a flooded road and a loose wheel fitting, and 31 years of my being unable to stop following him into rooms he had no business entering, she read him the way she read everything. Accurately, without assumption, with the full attention of a person who intends to understand what they are actually looking at. She decided he could read the deed or he couldn't. She handed it to him and waited. He told me he decided to be worth that. That is his account, and it is accurate as far as it goes. What I also know, what I watched with my own eyes through 8 weeks and a year, and what Lady Cecily said at the wedding in 4 words that were not about Marcus at all. She required him to be, is that being worth it was not a project he undertook. It was something he had always been, waiting in the cold of 4 years, that she did not coax or demand or expect. She simply responded to it correctly, the way she responds to everything correctly when she encountered it. He walks differently now. He is the same man, same height, same bearing, same face that has always kept its own counsel. But there is a quality in him that I have seen before only in the best moments of a long life watching people. The quality of a man who knows, at the end of the day, where he is going, and who finds, when he gets there, exactly what he expected to find. I went back to Halvenmere in the December of their first year, for Christmas. On the last evening of my stay, I was in the library after dinner, late, reading by the fire, and Marcus came in. He did not say anything for a moment. He sat down across from me and looked into the fire. After a while he said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I thought for a long time that what I had with Catherine was irreplaceable, the particular form of it, that I would not find it again and that it was right not to try and that the absence was what was left." He looked at the fire. "I was wrong about what I had with Catherine, not about what it was real and it mattered and I don't diminish it. But I was wrong about its form. I thought it was unique to her. That the thing I had felt was that specific shape and no other shape would hold it." He was quiet for a moment. "Elinor is not Catherine," he said. "She is nothing like Catherine. She argues differently, she thinks differently, she loves differently. If I had been looking for what I had before, I would have looked past her entirely." He paused. "But the thing underneath, the thing that makes a house a home, the thing that makes a room you want to be in, that is the same. She has it." He looked at me. "I didn't know it could come in a different shape." I said, "You know it now." "Yes," he said, quietly and completely. "I know it now." We sat by the fire until it burned low, and he did not say anything else, and he did not need to. Which is her at the desk, reading the 3rd document. She will look up. He will be home. And if there is a clause that requires attention, she will already know which one it is.